Thank you, Ambassador. It's great to be here. I understand you've heard from some of my colleagues earlier today, and I'm pleased to report to you about our efforts within the region, our engagement within the Americas, our relationships with Canada and Mexico and Central America and in the Caribbean. Sometimes I think it surprises people to learn that we have a strong international presence. We are the Department, after all, of Homeland Security. But what we have realized is that a lot of Homeland Security depends on active international engagement on a whole host of issues, be it from counterterrorism all the way to how we facilitate lawful travel and trade, how we support the global economy. We actually have people right now, today, in 75 countries around the world, and we have a footprint in every part of the world. We work with our international partners on everything from port security to conducting visa security checks to working to break up human trafficking rings. And since 2009, which is when I took office, we have signed over 130 international agreements. I personally have been in more than 30 countries as Secretary, working and negotiating with my counterparts bilaterally and multilaterally. I think the important point about that is that diplomacy now occurs at a number of different levels. You heard from the U.S. Trade Representative. It occurs at the trade level. The Secretary of State obviously has the lead level as the nation's lead diplomat. But with security being such a global concern now, there's a whole new era of relationships, types of relationships between people who have similar portfolios, ministers of Interior, the UK, the Home Secretary, and in the United States, the Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, of course, every country is unique, and every country faces different challenges. I think, however, there is a common thread to our work in the Americas and indeed throughout the world, and that is our desire to implement smart, effective security measures that not only make our nations and our citizens safer, but support the trade and travel essential to our economies. We believe that good, thoughtful, sensible security by its very nature facilitates lawful travel and trade. Homeland security and economic security therefore go hand in hand. Accordingly, we believe that security measures should, to the greatest extent possible, be designed to facilitate the safe and efficient movement of people and movement of goods across the world and across international boundaries. And as we have seen, we are so interlinked with nations around the world. A crisis or vulnerability anywhere has the ability to affect the flow of goods and people thousands of miles away. An air traveler departing Africa or a piece of cargo shipped from the Middle East can, well, I wrote this last week. This is an interesting line, can threaten a plane bound for the United States, Canada, Mexico, or indeed any other country in the Americas. Massive flooding in Thailand can drive up the global price of computer hard drives, just as an earthquake and a tsunami in Japan can grind assembly lines at U.S. auto plants to a halt. So we are looking both within and beyond our physical borders to develop strategies to keep our country and the region safe from threats that originate here at home or on the other side of the world. And as the department charged with securing our border, DHS has been transforming how we approach the relationship between security and trade. A key ongoing focus for us has been driving toward a more risk-based, information-driven approach to security, where what we know about a piece of cargo or a passenger allows us to better assess its risk and identify threats at the earliest possible moment. A risk-based approach is not just smart security, it's efficient security. It can decrease wait times, increase trade and travel, and importantly, keep costs down. And we know this because we're seeing it happening already. Our global entry program, for example, which allows pre-approved, low-risk air travelers expedited entry into the United States upon arrival, has reduced average wait times by about 70%, with more than 75% of travelers using global entry processed in under 5 minutes. We're now expanding the program as part of the administration's broader efforts to foster travel and tourism. This year alone, DHS will foster about $2 trillion worth of trade while enforcing U.S. trade laws that protect the economy and the health and safety of American citizens. So how are we doing this? What are some of the examples that I could cite? Let me begin with Canada. The United States and Canada enjoy the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world. We have total trade between the U.S. and Canada of over $1 trillion. To build on this strong collaboration, last year President Obama and Prime Minister Harper announced the Beyond the Border Action Plan. Under the plan, we are working within, at, and away from the border to enhance our security and facilitate the legitimate flow of goods, people, and services across it. Integrated industries, like the automotive industry, have operations on both sides of that shared border. These sectors have traditionally faced a web of overlapping security and regulatory requirements. Through the Beyond the Border Action Plan, we are working to enhance global competitiveness by 1, aligning and coordinating our cargo security systems, 2, enhancing the benefit of trusted trader programs, and 3, decongesting key border crossings by developing joint facilities and programs to move inspections away from the border. We've also invested heavily in the port infrastructures themselves, including over $400 million in Recovery Act funds used to modernize the older facilities along the U.S.-Canadian border. With respect to Mexico, we've also taken significant action to enhance security as well as travel and trade. We have deployed unprecedented resources to the southwest border, including more personnel, more technology, and more infrastructure than ever before. And these efforts have had a major impact. Illegal immigration attempts, as measured by apprehensions, are at their lowest levels since 1971. Let me just say that again. Illegal immigration attempts are at their lowest levels since 1971, and they're continuing to go down. Seizures of drugs, cash, and weapons are up. And some of the safest communities in the United States are actually those along the southwest border. In addition, through efforts like the Merida Initiative and the 21st Century Border Management Declaration, President Obama and President Calderon have also worked to fight the cartels and interdict narcotics going north and guns and bulk cash going south, support Mexican efforts to further develop modern and effective Mexican customs, immigration, and security capacities, coordinate binationally to replace or improve outdated border crossing facilities and innovative solutions for additional infrastructure, and have worked toward mutually recognized trusted trader programs, trusted shipper programs, to expedite the secure flow of goods across the southwest border. Now, I've been engaged in southwest border issues for the better part of 20 years as the U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona, the Attorney General of Arizona, the two-time Governor of Arizona. That's all right. And now is the DHS Secretary. And I will tell you, based on that experience, our partnership with Mexico has never been stronger. We've actually implemented something called active lane management, which leverages ready lanes, dedicated commuter lanes, and new signage to allow our officers to monitor in real time primary vehicle lanes so we can redesignate traffic flows as conditions warrant. Keep the traffic moving through the ports. And in Central America, we're actively engaging our partners as well to improve our ability to detect and deter a range of transnational threats. This has been particularly important in the area of aviation security, where we all have an interest in keeping aviation safe and in disrupting transnational criminal organizations, including drug and human traffickers, who often seek to exploit the international aviation system. On the recent trip to Central America that the ambassador noted, we work to help all countries better detect and counter threats to aviation by sharing advanced information about passengers. Honduras and Panama have signed agreements with us, as well as Costa Rica, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And we are also working and committed to working with the other countries of Central and South America as well. We're helping governments in the region build their technological capacity to screen air passengers against criminal databases, and we are training their Customs and Border Security officers to detect contraband. And the governments there have been very enthusiastic about building this kind of capacity because it can have immediate impacts on their citizens as well. Panama, for example, is partnering with us in a joint security program at Tocuman International Airport, which is the busiest airport in Central America and a real pinch point for travel into this hemisphere from around the world. The program includes personnel from our Customs and Border Protection and our Immigration and Customs Enforcement units who provide technical assistance to help Panamanian officials identify, interdict, and investigate illicit travelers. This pilot has been very successful and has only been up for a little bit. We've already seized $2.2 million in cash, a large amount of drugs, and we've made over 100 arrests of illegal travelers. We believe that things like this joint security program with Panama can serve as a model for the entire region. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize JATF South, Joint Interagency Task Force South, which combines maritime, aviation, and intelligence assets from multiple U.S. departments and foreign partners under the leadership of a U.S. Coast Guard Rear Admiral located in Key West. This command serves as the model for U.S. interagency cooperation to combat transnational criminal organizations with ongoing operations in the Caribbean Basin and the Eastern Pacific to monitor and interdict illegal trafficking, including drug trafficking into the United States. Nearly all of the drug seizures in the maritime environment in the Caribbean or off the coast of Central America are the result of JATF South operations, and nearly 80% of all cocaine disruption by local, state, or federal U.S. government entities is tied to JATF South as well. Finally, I'd like to mention our work on global supply chain security, which is a major priority not just for the department, but for the entire administration. As many of you know, this challenge is large and complex, stretching across air, land, and sea environments, as well as spanning a wide range of industries, infrastructure, and transit systems. In January, I announced the United States National Strategy for Global Supply Chain Security when I attended the World Economic Forum. The new strategy is the result of more than 2 years' worth of work and collaboration with hundreds of public and private sector partners. The strategy has two main goals: promote the efficient and secure movement of goods and foster a more resilient supply chain. This is essential because, as I mentioned, the interconnectedness makes the efficient use of the global supply chain also something that experiences disruption that can have multiple effects. At its core, the strategy is about taking a layered risk-based approach to increase the security of the movement of goods. Our goal is to maximize the flow of commerce and smartly build and integrate security measures into that flow of cargo as cargo moves around the world. And the National Global Supply Chain Strategy didn't just spring out of nowhere. We've had some experience on how to build it. One part of that was a program called Global Shield, which was a program initiated with the World Customs Organization to share information about the export of 14 precursor chemicals that can be used in the manufacture of IEDs. We are applying the same measures that we use in Global Shield now to the entire global supply chain. And with that, we are able to provide broader security for maritime cargo, air cargo, and cargo crossing land borders. We are reviewing our foreign partners' cargo screening requirements to see what their level of security is. We continue to partner directly with the international trade community to provide expedited cargo processing through programs like CPAT, which has grown from 7 participating companies in its first year to more than 10,200 companies today. And I might add, we now have more than 1.3 million people enrolled in our various trusted traveler programs, which allow for expedited clearance at our land ports of entry. And finally, through the Container Security Initiative, we are now operational in over 50 seaports, including the ports in Central and South America, helping our partner countries identify and screen U.S.-bound maritime containers. I think these programs reflect our commitment to work closely with our partners across the region. I could discuss many other areas of collaboration as well. For example, our efforts to secure cyber networks in various countries and with various international partners, our efforts to work on response to natural disasters, including, for example, the devastating earthquake in Haiti. But I think it's easier or more plain simply to say that we are doing everything we can to bring new strategies to the effort to make security and economic efficiency consistent and with each other, that they're not opposing goals, they are integrated goals. You can't have one without the other. And with that, I thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Well, Secretary, it's great to be with you again. Good to see you. It's harder to know what not to ask you on a morning like this because a lot of news has been crossing the wires that directly or indirectly affects your department. So let's talk about the, as you alluded to in your remarks, the latest bomb plot against an international jet. What can you tell us about where things stand with that? What do we know about the attempt and how it was foiled?
Well, the plot, is my mic on, by the way? Can you hear me? Hold on just a minute. Technology adjustment. How's that? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Sound like the guy in the ad. Can you hear me now? This was first of all, I want to say that the device was always under control and that no one in the United States was ever at risk because we did have control. It is a device similar to the underwear bomber of 2009, but an evolution from that. And we always speak about the evolving threats of terrorism, and I think we have to acknowledge that our adversaries are very creative and they are very determined and they are very persistent. And that requires us to always be thinking proactively, not just reactively. It requires us to look at all of the various layers in travel to make sure we minimize the risk that one of these plots could survive. And it requires, good collaboration with our international partners, with the intel community around the Beltway, and to our operational agencies. And that, I think, was demonstrated. I think we can say that it was an AQAP plot. And I think beyond that, ask me another question.
Okay. Well, you've talked about the evolution of American responses to these attempts to attack the United States. At another time in our history, before the level of coordination, before the level of sophistication of forward intelligence. Could an attack like this have succeeded at another time? And because of everything that's been put in the years since 9/11, are we better able to foil these kinds of things?
Yes, I think if this plot had occurred prior to 9/11, in all likelihood it would have succeeded. In today's date, with all the various layers we have, in all likelihood it would not have succeeded. And it did not succeed.
Today, the Border Patrol is announcing a new set of policies that they have called one of the biggest reframing of their policy and operations on the border in many, many years. What does it consist of? What are some of the main points? What's going to change on the border?
Well, I think the way we look at the border is in various ways. First of all, we have literally thousands of agents at the border. But in addition to boots on the ground, we now have boots on the air. So we now can have air coverage along that border, and from there, you know, your boots on the ground are so much more effective. So we have that. Our work with Mexico has really made our work at the border easier because we are better able to share information. And criminals who come in a variety of types are less able to transit that border or to exploit that border for their own ends. With that, however, when you tighten up at the border, the traffic moves. It shifts. It can be like a bedspread. You know, you pull one corner and the other corner will move. We've had a tremendous focus on Arizona. We've seen some of the traffic just begin to move to the South Rio Grande Valley. What is different now is, rather than wait for there to be a true spike in that traffic along the South Rio Grande Valley, we are pre-positioned, and now we're able to surge resources there to prevent that kind of movement. In other words, we can now say that that border from Brownsville to San Diego is secure in that sense.
The head of the Border Patrol says one of the main parts of the new policy is an emphasis on repeat crossers. Why are they important to your overall efforts on the border?
Because they're exploiting the border. One of the things that we are doing in immigration as a whole is saying, look, and I'm going to talk from border to interior enforcement, look, as in all law enforcement, immigration enforcement ought to have priorities that are set. So we set priorities on those who have criminal convictions in addition to being in the country illegally, on the theory that they're impacting public safety in addition to other things. We put a priority on those who are fugitives from existing warrants, those who are simply evading justice, and then repeat border crossers. Why? Because we want that border to be safe and secure. We don't want it to be a means of travel for those trying to enter the country illegally.
Just recently, in the last 10 days or so, the Pew Hispanic Center came out with an estimate that said the net traffic inflow to the United States of illegal immigrants is now zero.
Right.
Between lower illegal traffic trying to enter the country and a lot of people going home voluntarily, there may even be a net decrease in the number of illegally resident people in the United States. Is that the economy? Is it your department? A little of both? I mean, something's going on. How do you assess it?
Well, the Pew study itself attributed that to increased border enforcement and economic, the economy in the United States and the economy of Mexico. So that, say, for example, in the 1990s, when we were seeing true spikes of illegal immigration across the border, one year there were 600,000 plus apprehensions in Arizona alone, a state of 6.5 million, to give you a sense of proportion. And they were coming to, by and large, to work, construction, hotel industry and so forth. Those jobs no longer available to them or available easily. The economy of Mexico, particularly some of the states of northern Mexico, now beginning to show some economic activity of their own. And then, quite frankly, the border is a very different place. It is an enforced border. It is a secure border. It is much more difficult to cross, and it's much more difficult to cross going back and forth.
Eventually, the economies that went south so precipitously a couple of years ago and started to push that flow of people going home, that's going to recover.
Yeah.
When that happens, will many of those same people simply come back into the United States? Or if things changed on the border in such a way that when that demand increases in a restaurant in Chicago, in a construction site in Phoenix, in the fields in Florida and the Carolinas, will people simply not be able to come back in the same way?
I don't think they will come back in the same way that we saw. It's just plain too difficult. And as the U.S. economy flourishes, the Mexican economy, which is tied in many respects to the U.S. economy, is set to flourish as well. So I don't think we'll see the same thing. And we may indeed see, as we are already seeing in the agriculture industry, a cry for labor. And one of the things that Congress, I hope, recognizes is that one of the reasons for immigration reform are the labor economics that are involved, as well as some of the other issues implicated in immigration. And we can do all we can from an executive standpoint to set priorities and to focus, to build out that border. We've done all of that. But what we cannot do is reform of the immigration law itself, which is sorely needed.
Well, interesting. The Obama administration announced a reprioritization of the mechanism for deporting people, saying that it would concentrate on those who had committed crimes in the United States and concentrate less on working family members, people with clean records, and really try to get those people out first who present the most danger to the United States. Well, you've been a federal prosecutor, as you mentioned. You've been your state's chief law enforcement officer. Is that something that's easy to do when you've got such an enormous pool of people who face deportation? Can you set in motion a system of selective prosecution that protects the country first and then at some time in the future says, okay, let's turn to these other people?
Well, I wouldn't call it selective prosecution. I would call it prioritization that makes common sense. And yes, you're right. You don't just flip a switch and do that. The whole system has to turn. Realize we had hundreds of thousands of cases already in the system when we announced this change. So one of the things we're having to do, and the lawyers in my department are having to do, is they are going through all of the pending immigration cases in the pipeline, some 330,000 cases, and restacking them in accord with the priorities. So from the enforcement side, the agent on the street, we're asking them to do more operations like cross-check, which is a big fugitive warrant, criminal conviction effort. So changing the input into the system, restacking the cases out that are in the system already. And then there's going to be a group of cases that have worked their way through almost to deportation or removal. And on those, we're still exercising discretion. Because, we think that the immigration enforcement should be tough and fair, but it also should be smart. And we should be spending our resources on those who are most susceptible to removal and deportation.
In the process, instead of making one side of this persistent argument unhappy, you've made both sides unhappy. There have been cases.
Talent, yeah.
I mean, there's been advocates of wider access to legal status who are saying there are still breadwinners going home, heads of household being sent home. Cases like the much publicized valedictorian in a Miami-Dade high school, and they're held up as an example of the policy not working. And on the other side of the question, there are people grumbling because they're saying there are people who are already in the pipeline who aren't getting sent home.
Well, all I would say there is immigration is obviously a tough area. It requires you to understand the entire system. It requires you to balance working with an inadequate law. And the plain fact of the matter is the cases of the Miami valedictorian, and I think her deportation was stayed, actually. They're still coming through the system, but at a much lower rate than before. 90% plus of the removals last year were in our priorities. That's a big change from 3 years ago. So the system is turning. But there will always, under any immigration law, be some instances of hardship. Immigration's a tough area in that respect. On the other hand, we have actually, in the last 3 years, removed more people from the country than any administration has in the nation's history. We've been very effective at it. And we have good lawyers, and we have good agents, and we think we are focused appropriately. So I think there are good responses to both arguments.
Along with people deciding on their own to pick up, perhaps go with friends and relatives, perhaps pay a coyote, there are people who are in the business of moving bodies around this country, and I know your department has been concentrating on trying to interdict human trafficking. What are the points that we should know about in this room? Where are people coming in from, and what interests are involved in trying to get human beings across borders, across oceans, and into the United States?
Oh, it's a terrible, insidious business, and it is global in nature. In fact, a lot of our international work involves human traffickers. We have them coming out of Asia. We have them coming out of some of the former republics of the Soviet Union. We have them coming from Central America and Mexico. Some are young children brought here to basically be slaves. Some are young women brought here basically to be prostituted. You name it, they're brought here. One of the most amazing, sometimes in the immigration area you see so much that's bad, but sometimes something happens that's good. We had a young woman, and the neighbor observed her during the school day in this home, and they alerted us. And we went over to the home and found that she was basically being kept as a household slave. And we took her out. We granted her immunity to stay in the country. She now is in college, and she has stated that her career organization is to join us as an ICE agent, because she recognizes that kind of work is ICE as well.
Has that business changed? Every now and then you'll hear about a truck being found parked along the side of a road somewhere in the southwestern United States, and they throw up in the back, and there's 50 suffering people in there, and those are terrible cases. But just as everything else has gotten faster, more high-tech, and has sources that you never even thought of before, has the international trafficking of persons become a smarter, more sophisticated, more aggressive game and tougher to fight?
Yeah, I think so. I think the internet has accelerated some of it, and the communication via the internet. We now see persons trafficked by air. One of the things that we have begun is training airline personnel on how to recognize the signs of human trafficking. So all of those things, are at play. Another area of attack for us is to look at the money, right? You have the human beings who are being trafficked, and then you've got the line with the money. And so we work a lot with our international partners, with the Justice Department, with the Treasury Department on the financing of this business.
Those same tools that you're talking about being used to defeat bad guys moving money around are also being used to commit enormous crimes, whether it's to break into what had been thought a secure database and root around and steal what was in there. Sometimes it's just nothing more than vandalism, like breaking a window to show you can do it. Sometimes it's something really frightening, like turning off all the electricity in a major American city. Has DHS taken a lead role in combating cybercrime.
Yeah, we have. We actually, this is one of the little known parts of DHS, but it's becoming more public as the Congress debates a cybersecurity bill. But we have built up a large cyber division. It includes other departments of the federal government. We're responsible for securing the federal networks. We're also responsible for the intersection with the private sector, which owns about 85% of the nation's critical infrastructure. And we have just over the river in Northern Virginia, a large center, a 24/7 ops center, that last year we responded to about 106,000 cyber incidents from. And they ranged from the hacker to the more insidious attempts to gain control of control systems and the like. This is an area that's rapidly evolving, fast growing. It's probably the key new security area that we are confronting in this decade.
But again, a lot of the people who are ready to commit these crimes aren't inside the United States. And the Internet's great, wonderful strength, that it erases time zones, erases geography, everybody's sort of in the same place, also makes it one of the toughest things to find, because the people trying to do these things can be anywhere.
That's right. And the servers can be anywhere, et cetera, et cetera. So it's tough in part because there's really no good international framework to hang our hat on. So what we end up doing is working either bilaterally or multilaterally in a very episodic way on a particular kind of case or a particular infiltration. But there's no kind of institutional framework that deals with cyber. And at some point, the international community is going to have to do that.
I told your people I was going to ask because I would have to turn my press pass in if I didn't, and I don't want to do that. But what's the latest with the Secret Service? I know that the investigation had been widened to include other countries and previous trips. Has anything turned up from that widened investigation?
Actually, no. I mean, I think you're referring to the allegations about behavior in El Salvador. And the answer is we have not been able to find any basis to that particular allegation. But look, what happened in Colombia was inexcusable. We've dealt with it in a couple of ways. One, we made sure immediately that the president's security had not been diminished. Two, we moved, and the director moved very quickly with respect to disciplinary action against the agents involved. Three, we instituted a review of practice, procedures, training, and protocols to make sure this doesn't happen again. But I will say, having worked with the service 3.5 years in a very close way, this is a very dedicated group of men and women, and they are very professional, and I think they feel probably more damaged than anyone else by this misbehavior. So we're working to make sure that the public's confidence in the Secret Service is maintained.
And incidentally, I mean, she's now the world's most famous escort, but Ray Suarez is not a source of mine, not a related person. It's a distaff branch of the Suarez family, which has not covered us in glory in the last 2 weeks. One thing I forgot to ask you about the Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula bomb plot. There are many American agencies involved in trying to pick this stuff up. And your department is sort of the newest player on the scene, coming into an already existing geography, mechanics of getting the word out. When something like this happens, do you get a phone call from Yemen? Does your waistband start to buzz? I mean, what happens to clue you in? Because you ought to know this is going on, right?
Well, yeah, and without speaking of this, I think the important point is DHS is now involved from the outset. And one of the things that we do is make sure that we maintain all the measures necessary to keep air travel safe, make whatever adjustments might be necessary. but translating intel into something that is operational at the international level, operational at the domestic level, and is in a form that can be shared either at the secret level or indeed even at the unclassified level out into the state and local environment. That really wasn't done in an organized way before DHS. And so we work with the FBI on some of this, but yeah, we have a lot of involvement in that regard.
Reports from major American airports talking to air travelers say that they didn't notice anything different. But do you have to operate on the assumption that a bomb like this is not the only one when it's first discovered, when a plot like this is uncovered?
Yes. I mean, prudence dictates that you be very conservative in your judgments and that you're constantly evaluating what you are doing to minimize the risk that one of these plots will succeed. And so you always have to be asking the what-if question. What if there are others? What if there's another type of bomb that's being experimented with? What if another group decides to hop on the copycat wagon? How do you respond? And so that's what makes the constant interaction with our foreign partners, again, as I mentioned during my talk, there's this whole level of international communication that goes on now because of global terrorism concerns and that new kind of environment that probably didn't exist, 20 years ago.
I'm glad you mentioned cargo security, because that became the subject of great attention when port operations in several American ports wanted to be sold to an international player in port operations, and people started to take a look. Well, let's take a closer look at this. When I visited some ports, I saw amazing machines that let you look inside metal containers and see exactly what was in there. Giant truck tires for tractors, amphoras. I didn't even know anybody shipped anything in amphoras anymore, filled with vanilla extract from East Africa. Amazing stuff. But then I asked the guy who was operating it how many of the containers he gets to actually look at. There were so few of those machines in so few ports that only a tiny percent of containers coming into the United States got that close inspection. Are there more? Is a load coming in more likely to be looked at more closely? Are we safer than we were on that score a couple of years ago?
We are safer, but let me tell you, port security is a very complex matter. We receive cargo from 700, 800 ports around the world. They all can't contain that kind of equipment. And that's why we have to take a risk-based approach. That's why we have things like the Container Security Initiative. That's why we have the Trusted Shipper programs. That's why we're working with the World Customs Organization, the International Maritime Organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization on common security measures that will be applied to all cargo. But there is a statute, the Safe Ports Act, which says we are supposed to physically screen 100% of all cargo coming into the United States, and both from a cost and efficacy standpoint, we now have learned that's not the best way to go.
You're constantly trying to strike that balance, aren't you? I mean, if you try to X-ray every load coming into the United States, nothing would ever get anywhere.
That's right. And that when I talked about security and efficiency having to go hand in hand, that would mean security trumping everything, and you would see the clogging of the ports like you've never seen before.
So how do you get that sweet spot between getting stuff where it has to go efficiently and cheaply, and still making sure that the cargoes that need a second look get it?
Well, first of all, you start at the beginning of where the cargo began. You deal with trusted shippers, and when I say that, that can also include like a forwarder, a consignor, anybody in that chain. That means, to the extent you can, you have security measures at the last point of departure for a U.S. port. It means you have manifests and other things coming to the United States about cargo well before the ship actually arrives. That means you have different levels of things that you do at the actual physical port, be it putting it through a machine, going over it with handhelds, doing a physical inspection, and we do some of that on a targeted basis and some on a totally random basis, so that hopefully the bad guys can't figure out exactly what we're doing at any point in time.
If you ask people who set up programs, they would tell you that the main job of a moderator is not to ask good questions, though that's an important part of the job. The main part is to get off on time, and so we shall. Secretary, good to see you.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you all. Thank you very much.